Hi, it's Katrina. Get ready for some of the world's greatest secrets. Today, I'll be talking about mythical treasures hidden by the Nazis, the FBI stealing gold and covering up alien abductions, and archaeological conspiracies that nobody is supposed to know about. So let's go! Hunting for mythical treasures. Thor's hammer, the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, and monoliths from past civilizations. What do all of these great things have in common? The Nazis tried to find them. During the rule of the Third Reich, one of the Nazis' best-kept secrets was how obsessed their leaders were with discovering mythical objects. A reminder of this past obsession can be found at Wewelsburg Castle in Germany, the old headquarters of Heinrich Himmler and the SS. Himmler and other top Nazi members believed in a supremacist worldview. They thought the German people were the best people on the globe, and that they needed to establish a new Aryan empire. In order to do this, they tried bringing to life ancient Germanic myths. The Nazis wanted to destroy traditional Christianity. They wanted to bring forth a sort of chivalric mysticism inspired by the Knights Templar, the Crusaders, and King Arthur's court at Camelot. Himmler himself believed the Holy Grail existed, and you bet he was going to find it. He was one of the men who helped establish the occult organization known as the Ahnenerbe. He ordered the group to find out which parts of the world still understood the ancient secrets of how to wield thunderbolts like Zeus, and how to fling around a lightning hammer like Thor. It was his firm belief that Thor's hammer was a highly sophisticated weapon of war, one built by ancient Aryans in Europe who had access to incredible technology. Himmler himself went on a mission to discover the Holy Grail in 1940. He believed the Grail was hiding somewhere near an abbey in the Montserrat mountain range in Catalonia in Spain. But as far as anyone knows today, he never found it. But the Nazis did find some stuff, like a priceless object forged from a meteorite that crashed into the planet 15,000 years ago. In 1938, Heinrich Himmler supported German scientist Ernst Schaefer's journey into Tibet to search for secrets of the ancient world. The Nazis were convinced there would be traces of Shambhala in Tibet. They hoped to find great towering megaliths left behind by a superior race of ancient humanoids, or perhaps carved with secrets of the universe. Nobody knows precisely what the German scientist found on his expedition. Perhaps he did find traces of a lost world, but the Nazis kept quiet about it. One of the objects brought back to Germany was a small statue of the god of Vaisravana with a swastika in its center. It was made from a meteorite that landed along the border of Siberia and Mongolia by a Buddhist culture in the mountains 1,000 years ago. Well, to the Nazis it was a swastika, but for the Buddhists it was a manji, and it signifies the Buddha's footsteps. Unfortunately, the original swastika symbol was corrupted by Hitler and his forces. A cover-up of gold. A treasure hunter in the U.S. accused the FBI of covering up a missing shipment of gold from 1863. This happened in 2023, with the accuser actually suing the FBI. His name is Dennis Parada. He sued the FBI in a bid to force them to turn over records of their 2018 excavation in Dens Run, Pennsylvania. The FBI did in fact search a remote area for a lost stash of gold worth upwards of a fortune. There isn't an exact figure, but experts believe the gold is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. According to the FBI, they didn't find anything. They excavated, found diddly squat, and that was it. Dennis Parada claims the FBI is lying. Dennis also claims they destroyed key evidence of their investigation and will not release records of their search. It's Dennis's belief that the FBI found the gold and is keeping it all for themselves. He sued the Justice Department to force the FBI to release their records. However, the judge ruled in favor of the Justice Department. So just whose gold is this? It was in Dents Run that a massive shipment of gold disappeared into thin air in 1863. It was Union gold on its way to the U.S. Mint in Philadelphia, but it never arrived. It's believed the gold was buried and forgotten about until the FBI discovered its location. Dennis's consultant in the matter is Warren Gettler, the author of Rebel Gold. He is an expert in buried Civil War-era caches of silver, trinkets, gold, and all kinds of goodies. Warren said that all evidence points to a covert excavation at night. The FBI went into the remote woodland, quickly dug up the gold under the cover of darkness, and then fled. To this very day, the FBI denies any kind of conspiracy or cover-up. UFOs and shocking mutilations. If the government can cover up a cache of gold that the FBI recovered in the dark of night, allegedly, they shouldn't have much of an issue covering up an alien abduction. Listen to this incredible story and let me know in the comments what you think. You don't hear much these days about cattle mutilations, farm animals discovered bloodless and seemingly experimented on, but it used to be in the news frequently. Across the western and midwestern states, farmers found their cattle looking like they had been abducted by alien vampires and drained of their blood. But did you know the same thing happened to humans? One of these victims was a sergeant in the American Air Force. He was abducted by a flying saucer, and then his body was found in the New Mexican desert. I told you this was going to be an incredible story. The case was allegedly studied by Project Grudge, one of the earliest Air Force programs charged with investigating UFO sightings after World War II. It was the precursor to the Project Blue Book, which you might be a little more familiar with. Project Blue Book was around from 1951 until 1969. Many of their documents have now been declassified. One of Project Grudge's most secret documents was a mysterious 600-page report. It was called Report 13, but don't bother trying to look for it. Every trace of it is gone. The U.S. government denies that any such report was ever made. The details of the report are only known by a few people who claim that they saw the original document in the early 1970s. One of these people was controversial researcher William Cooper, who passed away in 2001. He claimed to have seen Report 13 with his own two eyes. Another person who saw it was former Green Beret Captain William English, while he was working at a Royal Air Force base in England. What's really interesting is that William English dictated a pair of audio cassettes, repeating what he remembered from the report. He and William Cooper had nearly identical memories of the document. The report went like this. In March of 1956, Sergeant Jonathan P. Loveit was in the White Sands missile testing grounds near the Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico. If you've been watching the channel a lot, you'll remember the Holloman Air Force Base was where some exciting new archaeological finds were made. But anyways, while searching for debris from a rocket test, Major William Cunningham heard a scream. He thought Jonathan had been bitten by a snake, but when he turned to look, Jonathan was being pulled by a huge, shiny serpentine arm into a silver disc that hovered 20 feet above them in the sky. Keep watching to learn what became of Jonathan. The city underneath the Sphinx. There might just be an entire city hidden underneath the Sphinx. What's the catch? We can't get to it. And by we, I mean nobody. The Sphinx is one of the most visible monuments in the world. You can walk right up to it and look into the Sphinx's sandy limestone ear hole, but nobody is allowed to see what is hiding underneath. Did you know that Sphinx isn't what the statue was originally called? Sphinx was the name given to the monument by the Greeks centuries after it was built. It's believed the Egyptians originally called it Horimaket, which means Horus in the horizon. The statue likely represented the dawn and the early morning sun. Its face was made to resemble the face of Pharaoh Khafre of the 4th dynasty. There are all kinds of arguments about what the Sphinx was for and how old it is. Some experts have identified water damage on the flanks of the Sphinx, suggesting it was around prior to the biblical flood. That means it wasn't even the Egyptians who built it. There have even been recent studies published in which scientists claim the Sphinx was a natural monument. It just so happened to be shaped like a mythical beast through thousands of years of wind erosion. But let's get back to the city hidden underneath the mysterious figure. I'll start our investigation in 1565 with Johann Helffrich. The adventurer wrote that when he visited Egypt at the end of the Middle Ages, he witnessed a priest enter the head of the Sphinx. When the priest spoke, it sounded as if the Sphinx itself was speaking, like the guy had a megaphone blaring from the Sphinx's mouth. There indeed was a hole in the Sphinx's head. In 1926, Émile Barrès closed the hole with a metal hatch, and it's been sealed ever since. Going back in 1837, a hole was drilled in the back of the Sphinx, just underneath its head, and they managed to get 27 feet deep before their boring rods got stuck. When the drillers tried to blast the rods free, they caused immense damage to the Sphinx, and the hole wasn't cleared until 1978. The amount of damage that's been done to this thing over the years is tremendous. In 1926, Émile Barrès directed the Sphinx to be cleared of sand. This was the same guy who sealed the hole in the monument's head. When the sand was cleared, an opening was revealed at the Sphinx's rump. The opening led to a tunnel, which presumably led to somewhere, but instead of exploring it, the hole was sealed by masonry and forgotten for the next 50 years. Then came one of the most mysterious excavations in Egyptian history. In 1980, the rump passage was rediscovered and digging commenced. There was one tunnel that led up into the body of the Sphinx and ended at a small cavity. The other tunnel went deep down into the bedrock for 13 feet before ending in a water pit. And that was when excavations stopped for good. It's entirely possible the tunnel kept going, but why didn't archaeologists pump out the water and keep searching? And why is this rump passage such a secret today? There are theories that deep beneath the Sphinx, and indeed under the pyramids as well, is an entire city more than 12,000 years old. It's believed the residents of this underground metropolis built the Sphinx in 10,500 BC to align with the constellation Leo. What do you think about all this? Let me know in the comments. And now for a quick break, but first, it's shout-out time! I want to give a big thank you to Hugh Fuller and Quark Lepton for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like this. Destroying proof of the Nephilim. The Smithsonian Institution destroyed thousands of giant human skeletons that could have proven the Nephilim and their offspring once walked the earth. That's the rumor anyway. The rumor has been around for over a century that in the early 1900s, the Smithsonian Institution went on a rampage of destruction. Giant human skeletons were being found all across America. To stop word from getting out, the government ordered them to cover it up. This may be a rumor, but the shocking truth is that it's based entirely on reality. In the early part of the 20th century, reports were coming in from across the country of people discovering skeletons between 7 feet and 20 feet tall. All of these were looted from Native American burial mounds. The legend of giants goes back even earlier. The earliest European settlers believed in a pre-Columbian civilization that dominated the Americas prior to the rise of Native Americans. This was used by settlers to reframe their colonization as the continuation of a primordial past, in which the roles of native peoples were dismissed or diminished. They believed the ancient people of the Americas were a white race, descended from Adam and Eve. In the desert ruins of the Southwest and in the earthworks of the Mississippi Valley, European colonizers saw signs of a mighty culture. It's true, there were many mighty cultures in ancient North America. Ancestral Puebloans built epic cities from the sand and stone of the deserts. In the south, the Cahokia culture built the biggest ancient city north of Mexico, but they didn't have white skin. It didn't take long before European settlers were telling stories of how the Native Americans exterminated a prehistoric white race of mound builders. These stories mixed with tales from the Bible, like the lost race mentioned in the book of Genesis, plus stories of the Spanish encounter with South American giants in 1519 became popular. The reason I'm giving you this little history lesson is so that you understand how easy it was for people to believe that giant skeletons were being found. Even Abraham Lincoln once referenced a lost race of giants living with mastodons when describing how old Niagara Falls is. When giant bones started being dug out of the ground, people assumed they belonged to the Nephilim. A humongous skeleton unearthed in Tennessee made its way across the country as a glorified carnival sideshow. It stood 20 feet tall and was mounted to a timber frame patched with bits of wood and rawhide. Even doctors confirmed it to be a legit human skeleton, just a little bigger than normal. That was until the skeleton wound up in New Orleans, where Dr. William Carpenter dismissed it as the remains of a mastodon. Take a look at this newspaper clipping from 1900. It lists prehistoric giants and where they were found in North America. One of the giants was found in San Diego at more than 8 feet tall. Another was discovered in Glendive that stood 9 feet tall. You might be wondering where the Smithsonian Institution comes into the equation. In 1934, Alice Herdlicka was the curator of anthropology at the institution. He rejected the idea of a race of giants unequivocally. Alice said that people were easily fooled into believing what they wanted to believe. He also noted there were at least 2 or 3 reports of giant skeletons being found per month. This was what started the whole conspiracy theory. One man from the Smithsonian dismissed the idea of giants, so people started saying the Smithsonian was covering up the existence of giants. But hey, maybe they did destroy all the giant skeletons they could find. Maybe it was a cover-up done by a group of scientists who didn't want physical proof of biblical giants around. But why not? Secrets under Rome. There is a secret apartment complex hidden underneath Rome that pretty much nobody knows about. It's a hidden attraction that eludes the millions of tourists who wander the streets above. You can see it for yourself underneath the Trevi Fountain, but I can't tell you how to get there. It's all part of the adventure. The ancient site is called Vicus Caprarius, or the City of Water. It stood as a towering apartment block in the 1st century AD, 2,000 years ago. It didn't begin life as an apartment. Even the Romans weren't going to pay money to live like troglodytes without the sun. But as the city changed, it became buried under the streets of New Rome. Archaeologists didn't come across the apartment complex until the late 1990s. In the original excavations, researchers found tons of amazing treasures. Some of the artifacts are still on display in this dark and cramped ruin. Artifacts such as figurines made of terracotta, pieces of pottery from Africa, shattered mosaics, and hundreds of coins. Walking into Vicus Caprarius is like descending into a lost world. The experience is especially exciting because so few people know that Vicus Caprarius even exists. And to make matters doubly special, water still runs through the city via an ancient aqueduct called the Aqua Virgo. It was one of 11 aqueducts that brought fresh water to the residents of Rome. The Aqua Virgo is the same aqueduct that feeds water to the Trevi Fountain, way above the ruined apartment. The horrible fate of Jonathan Loveit. Let's get back to the report from March 1956. Sergeant Jonathan P. Loveit was in the White Sands missile testing grounds near the Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico when he was pulled into a flying saucer by some kind of weird alien arm. Major Cunningham watched in astonishment as the craft rose vertically into the sky and disappeared. Pretty soon, security teams arrived to investigate. Cunningham was so traumatized by what he witnessed that he had to be confined to the base hospital for observation. The base dispatched search parties, but nobody found any trace of Jonathan. Jonathan was missing for 3 days. Only then did his body turn up 10 miles from where he was allegedly abducted. His corpse was nude and horribly mutilated. He was taken back to the base to have an autopsy performed, but the autopsy only raised more questions than answers. Jonathan's organs had been removed. His tongue was severed from the lower part of his jaw. His eyes were taken out of his head. The coroner was astounded by the surgical skill used to remove the organs. It was like somebody cut them out using lasers. In addition to the missing organs, Jonathan had no blood. He had been completely drained of blood, but his vascular system was still intact, showing that he didn't die from bleeding out. So, what happened to Jonathan? The same thing happened to Jonathan that happened to dozens of cattle across the globe. Livestock mutilations spiked dramatically in the 1970s. It wasn't just cattle, but also sheep, horses, rabbits, and deer. And this wasn't a group of kids playing pranks. Lymph nodes were surgically removed, something I don't imagine that troublemaking teenagers know how to do. The corpses were also bloodless. And get this, it's not over. According to the Denver Post, in 2009, 4 calves were discovered in the exact same state as Jonathan Loveit. NPR reported that in 2019, 5 purebred bulls showed up dead with all of their blood gone and their body parts removed with expert precision. Mysterious mutilations are still happening, and sometimes they happen to humans. In 1988, a man's body was discovered in Brazil with his ears, eyes, and tongue removed. He was also bloodless and showed no sign of decomposition. Police were never able to identify the victim. Now for the cover-up. The cases of curious mutilations were so widespread that the FBI was asked to investigate. But according to documents that have been declassified, the FBI sort of gave up. They were, according to themselves, unable to reach a conclusion because of jurisdictional issues. But isn't this the FBI? I thought the whole point was that they have federal jurisdiction and could investigate all the cases in the United States. That doesn't seem like a real reason. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. The Secret Pyramids of China. China is home to some of the most epic pyramids in the world, but they keep them a secret. A quick tour of the skies above China, courtesy of Google Earth, can reveal around 40 pyramids spread across the Shanxi province of China. Not all of them are easily distinguishable, though. Many have been overgrown with weeds and grass. They've been forgotten for so long, the trees sprout out of them. Here's a great example. In this snapshot from Google Earth, can you spot the pyramid? Yes, it's in the bottom left corner. There is no mistaking the giant mound for a pyramid, especially when you know that there were dozens of others spread across the countryside. It's believed many of them are 8,000 years old. The Chinese pyramids are more similar to Mesoamerican pyramids, like the ancient ones in Mexico, than the pyramids of Egypt, Nubia, or Mesopotamia. They are huge earthen mounds rather than pointy constructs of stone blocks. But why is China so secretive about them? People have been trying to understand the mystery of China's pyramids for centuries. In the 1600s, a Roman Jesuit priest wrote that he had found pyramids in China. In 1785, French adventurer Joseph de Guigné wrote about them as well. In 1947, the Science newsletter reported that the Chinese pyramids were built using mud and dirt throughout a region little traveled in modern times. None of the pyramids have, according to all information available, ever been officially excavated. On the contrary, the Chinese government has gone through great lengths to try and get rid of them without physically destroying them. They have enacted measures such as planting trees along the mounds in perfect rows so that soon they will grow into a forest, acting as an umbrella to shield the pyramids from satellites. What are they hiding? The most logical explanation is that there are tombs underneath the mounds. You're probably familiar with the Terracotta Army, roughly 8,000 life-size soldiers found buried in the Grand Mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang, first Emperor of China. But did you know the terracotta soldiers were found underneath the ruins of what was basically a pyramid? The emperor was buried underneath a huge mound, just like the ones you can see today across the countryside on Google Earth. If you don't believe me, look for yourself. Here's a shot of Qin Shi Huang's burial from a distance. It's underneath that huge grassy hill, which is in fact a pyramid. You might also be interested in knowing that the emperor himself remains sealed in his tomb. China refuses to open his tomb inside the mausoleum. There might be nothing nefarious at all about the Chinese government concealing their pyramids. They might be trying to keep their ancestors' burial tombs a secret, not wanting to disturb their eternal rest. The secret captain's log of Christopher Columbus. Christopher Columbus was a man who loved his secrets. During his legendary voyage to the New World, he kept 2 captain's logs with him. One of the captain's logs was real, the other was a fake. The world was a mystical place in the 15th century. People didn't believe there was a landmass between Europe and China. They thought that if you sailed west, you would keep going across an endless ocean. Contrary to popular belief, most people didn't think the world was flat. They knew it was round. They just didn't know how big it was. Christopher Columbus had a hunch that if he kept going west, he would circle the planet and arrive in the east. His journey was seen as so hopeless that prisoners and men facing the death penalty were allowed to sail on his crew. Nobody thought they would ever come back. Christopher may have been determined, but his crew became untrusting and agitated as the voyage went on. Columbus needed a way to keep them calm and prevent a mutiny. This was where his fake captain's log came into play. The voyage began on August 3rd, 1492. By early October, they hadn't seen any land yet. Christopher had told his crew they would definitely hit land by October, so they were understandably nervous. To placate them, he had started fudging details in a secondary journal. It was almost the same as his real journal, only he wrote down smaller distances traveled. Christopher shared his fake journal with his crew to fool them into thinking they were not as far from Europe as they really were. It was a trick that lasted just long enough to make history. On October 11th, his crew was fed up. Columbus told them that if they didn't spot land in the next 2 days, they would turn around. The next day, somebody shouted land. The deception of Christopher Columbus didn't end with his fake log. He is credited as the man who discovered America, but he lied about it. The first man to see North America was Rodrigo de Triana. He was the sailor who shouted from the crow's nest of the ship. Columbus stole his thunder by claiming that he had already seen land the night before, but didn't tell anybody. These were not the worst crimes Christopher Columbus committed. Still, the fact that he so boldly tricked his crew and stole fame speaks volumes about his character. It's no wonder the Spanish government arrested him and stripped his titles in 1502. Let's not forget that Christopher Columbus was so terrible and such a liar that he was chained and dragged back to Spain from the world he allegedly discovered. The alien tomb of Peru. The Peruvian government has been doing their best to discredit an investigation that allegedly discovered mummified aliens in a cave. At the forefront of this bizarre conspiracy is Mexican journalist Jaime Maussan. He made the allegation that the Peruvian Ministry of Culture lied about labeling the mysterious alien bodies as a hoax. They lied because, according to Jaime, the truth would force history to be rewritten. The discovery has not been widely reported by any media outlets. The website, Gaia.com, did run a series of videos about it, but nothing appears to have been certifiably substantiated. The claim is that 6 bodies were recovered from a tomb near the Nazca lines. Each body was clearly of non-human origin, with strange skeletons and only 3 fingers on each hand. They appear to be either a type of unknown human species or 100% alien. Scientists carbon dated the corpses, revealing they died around 245 AD. Scientists with the Peruvian Ministry of Culture said the bodies were part of a trick. They had been made to look like aliens using grave-robbed, mummified remains of real ancient humans. But Jaime said the scientists never even saw them. How would they know what the bodies even were, or if they were real? Nobody's really sure what's going on in Peru, but the 3-fingered skeletons are not the only controversy. Peru is also home to lots of other strange skeletons, like the elongated skulled people of the Paracas culture, who many believe to be alien-human hybrids. Malta's ancient human history erased. A human presence from prehistoric days has been intentionally hidden on the European island of Malta. It's a tale that goes back about 400,000 years. Up until 12,000 years ago, temperatures varied, water levels were sporadic, and ice ages came and went. The sea level would drop up to almost 500 feet as all the water froze over the northern hemisphere. During these icy periods, enormous land masses would appear because all the water was gone. This was how the islands of Malta connected to Sicily during the last ice age, forming a single landmass. 24,000 years ago, humans walked from Sicily to Malta just like they walked from Siberia to North America across the frozen Bering Strait. It was only about 50 miles, a walk that could be done in a few days. A Paleolithic human presence on the island of Malta was a generally accepted fact at the beginning of the 20th century. 2 fossilized teeth were discovered by Maltese paleontologist Giuseppe Despot. He pulled them from a cave in 1917. A 3rd tooth was found by another Maltese scientist in 1936. All investigations pointed to a prehistoric population on the island. In 1939, war brought an end to the scientific research on Malta. When the war was over, Malta's past had been revised. Nobody knows why, but the narrative suddenly changed. Publications referencing humans from the Ice Age on Malta were eliminated. Scientists were bullied into claiming the first people in Malta arrived 7,200 years ago, rather than 24,000. Why did this happen? Was something found during World War II that caused authorities to crack down on revealing the island's history? Even in modern times, archaeological studies about Malta are looked on with incredible scrutiny. There are even sites and zones that have been altered. For example, the cave system of Gar Hassan. This beautiful cave overlooking the sea used to be a tourist attraction. Inside are ancient cave paintings that were made at least 12,000 years ago. The paintings were found by renowned rock art expert Professor Emmanuel Anati in the 1980s. Now, the paintings appear to have vanished. It's as if somebody scrubbed them off the cave wall on purpose. The irreversible damage is being blamed on vandalism. The Nazi treasure map. Something suspicious is going on with a Nazi treasure buried in a Dutch village. In May 2023, about 50 miles from Amsterdam in Almere, a team of archaeologists searched for a collection of jewels worth millions of dollars. Sadly, their search was fruitless. Not a fruit to be found. They packed up and left after only 4 hours. It was barely even a full day of work. Archaeologist Martin Bink, who was involved in the dig, said there's minimal chance of finding anything. Interest in the mysterious treasure spiked at the beginning of 2023 because the Dutch National Archives released a map. They had been hanging onto the map for 75 years. It was drawn by a Nazi soldier in 1945 to mark the location of a stolen treasure, like a pirate marking his buried booty. The map was only declassified because 75 years had passed, running out its confidentiality period. With the map now public knowledge, treasure hunters descended on the town hoping to find the stolen goods. But so far, no luck. What kinds of documents do you think will be declassified 50 years from now that will blow our minds? Let me know in the comments below. And thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and stick around for an older video you might have missed. Bye!
Manichaeism. Manichaeism is the secretive, extinct religion of the ancient world that almost nobody has heard of. At its height, Manichaeism had followers all the way from North Africa through the Middle East, Central Asia, and into China. It was founded around the year 216 by the prophet Mani in Iran, or what was back then Babylon, which at the time was a province of Persia. What made this religion so fascinating is that it didn't focus on a single deity. Instead, it's something called a dualistic religion. It preached a struggle between all that is good and evil in the universe. There was no god or unholy devil, no master of good and no master of evil. Instead, each of these forces was just a part of the greater universe and part of every human struggle. It became extremely popular and spread across much of the world. It started in Persia in 216, had reached Egypt by 244, inspired Manichaean monasteries to be built in Rome by 312, and had secured followers in southern France by 354. It was becoming a major competitor for Christianity. But it didn't work out in the end. The Christians realized they were under threat, and Roman Emperor Theodosius I stripped every believer of Manichaeism of their civil rights and essentially committed genocide. The emperor issued a decree in the year 382 that every Manichaean monk be killed, and so shortly after this, the religion was gone. Selling human fat. Unfortunately, innocent wives weren't the only things being put up for auction in 16th century Europe. You could buy a person at the market, or you could buy a raw chunk of human fat being sold by an executioner. And you won't believe what the human fat was used for. The scientific name for this material is Axungia hominis, but it's still just human fat, called poor sinner's fat back in the 16th century. When an executioner brought his axe down and chopped somebody's head off, they would then take the body of the executed prisoner and harvest all their fat. They bundled it up, took that fat to market, and sold it to whichever peasants had enough coin to pay. Or they sold it directly to a pharmacy. The fat would then be used to cure ailments like bone pain, gout, arthritis, and toothaches. This was a huge business for executioners. It was practiced for hundreds of years until the middle of the 18th century and held in apothecaries all across Europe. It wasn't just executed criminals who had their bodies harvested for fat. Dead soldiers did too. After the siege of Ostend in 1601, Dutch surgeons descended on the battlefield like vultures and picked every fallen soldier clean of their fat so that they could make a pretty profit off it. The One-Eyed Man and the Pig. In 1641, in New Haven, Connecticut, news spread of a monstrous pig-like beast with human features. This man-pig monster had supposedly been delivered by a sow owned by a farmer named Mrs. Wakeman. The immediate response from the local elders was that the horrible monster had been conceived through an unspeakable act of human and beast relation, and so an investigation was launched to get to the bottom of it. The pig mutant baby was allegedly about the full size of the other pigs, but with no hair on its body, its skin pale white, and only one eye in the center of its forehead. The rest of his face was also deformed, and it had no neck and no ears. Accusations quickly fell on a man named George Spencer. He had one glass eye, and the villagers immediately connected him to the one-eyed pig monster. They believed he'd gotten romantic with the female pig. He was arrested, put on trial, found guilty, and hanged in April of 1642. And that sums up the harsh reality of life in early America. Eating mummies. During a particularly dark time in Europe's history, men and women alike feasted on the blackened flesh of Egyptian mummies. It happened for a good 500 years, with people openly practicing cannibalism on corpses stolen from a foreign land. It was one of the worst crazes that ever plagued Europe, and it didn't end until we were almost in the 20th century. The thing is that people back then believed almost anything. And once word started to spread that you could eat a small vial of mummy dust to cure whatever sickness you had, people were all over it. Victorian English believed cannibalism could cure the bubonic plague, a hangover, headaches, and many other issues. The flesh from mummified bodies was so widely available it could be purchased by anyone, rich or poor. Although, of course, it wasn't like a slab of raw beef. The product, known as mumia, came in a small vial and was grounded into a powder. This powder tasted awful, but supposedly cured just about everything. The need for mummy flesh was so powerful that royal doctor Guy de la Fontaine traveled to the city of Alexandria in 1564 and witnessed con men making mumia out of dead peasants stolen from graveyards and off the streets. And even though after 500 years Victorians finally stopped eating mummies, they didn't stop torturing them. In the 19th century, it was popular to have unwrapping parties. This was when a group of people would get together with a freshly purchased Egyptian mummy. They would then unwrap the bindings for entertainment. The Drummer of Tedworth. The Drummer of Tedworth is the very first poltergeist that was ever officially recorded, a secret haunting from the 17th century. As far as the story goes, John Montpesson was a landowner in 1661 and a commissioned officer in the local militia. He was visiting Wiltshire when he came across a transient man by the name of William Drury. William had become a serious nuisance for the townsfolk because he wandered around all day banging relentlessly on his drum. Montpesson brought a case against the man basically because he was annoying, and Drury's drum was taken away from him. After this whole fiasco with the drum, Montpesson returned to his home in the town of Tedworth. The drum that had been confiscated from Drury then arrived at his house, sent by the bailiff in Wiltshire. After the drum found its way into the man's house, he and his family became the victims of the first recorded poltergeist. They experienced hammering on the doors, banging from the outside, and noises that sounded like someone was smashing the roof tiles. One night, Montpesson even chased the banging through the house with his pistol drawn, but couldn't find what was making all the noise. And things only got worse. Lights were seen moving by themselves to the house. A horrible smell began to pervade the home, and the children were shaken and lifted straight out of their beds. The vagrant, known as William Drury, was hunted down and brought to court and charged under the Witchcraft Act of 1604. Montpesson had enough evidence, thanks to neighbors and other people who had seen the haunting, to convict Drury of sending spirits after him. So Drury was sent to the new American colonies and was never seen again. Victorian wife auctions. In Victorian days, married women forfeited pretty much all of their rights over to their husband. They couldn't own property or work or sign contracts, and if her husband got tired of her, she could just be put up for auction. The first recorded case of someone selling off their wife was in 1553, although historians say it probably dates all the way back to the 11th century. It's just that because of the invention of newspapers, the wife auctions, which took place in England between 1750 and 1850, are the most famous. Take the case of Joseph Thompson in 1832. He was a local man from Cardiff who led his wife to the local marketplace, where he put her up for sale for 50 shillings. When asked to explain why he wished to sell his wife to the highest bidder, he called her a bosom serpent, a tormentor, and a daily devil. His wife had become such a pain to Mr. Thompson that he thought it would be easier to just sell her to somebody else. Now, you're probably thinking, why not just get a divorce? In Victorian England, divorce was only allowed if the husband or wife could prove extreme cruelty or adultery. It was also very expensive, and an act of parliament was required to ensure total legal separation. For many poor people during that time, wife selling was an alternative. Women would often agree to be sold in this way, but it was pretty much the same as selling livestock. However, the wife was allowed a veto and could reject the buyer if she didn't like him. This gave women some bargaining advantages and a welcome legal break from her husband. Sometimes the family would buy the wife back, or sometimes her lover. As the newspapers reported, the bargain being made, she went off in high spirits. It wasn't all fun and games, though, and this practice really fell out of favor as women gained more legal rights. Jus prime noctis. Jus prime noctis, which translates to right of the first night, is supposedly a barbaric practice that goes all the way back to the earliest days of Mesopotamia and continued into the Middle Ages. This practice was the right given to the noble of any particular town, village, or community that allowed him to deflower the peasant brides on their wedding night before their husbands. Basically, before the husband and wife joined as a couple, the ruling noble or baron or king would come along and do it first. Remember when Michael Scott declared prima nocta in The Office? Most people these days are familiar with Jus prima noctis through the movie Braveheart, but in fact historians don't actually know if it ever really happened. There are legends of it being around for 4,000 years, with the practice peaking in the medieval days, but there isn't actually a single document describing the incident. No victim's name has been written down, no stories passed through the generations, and not even one court case in history. In truth, most historians believe this was a dark fairy tale made up by the peasants themselves when they revolted. It was one of the arguments they used to rouse the people to rise up against the lords and landowners. Witches on brooms. Nobody knows who invented the broom or when, only that it definitely dates back to the most ancient of days. Somebody used a clump of thin sticks or reeds fastened to a stick to clean out dust and ash from a hearth. The broom hasn't changed much since then, except that starting in the Dark Ages, witches began to ride on them. Oddly enough, the first witch who confessed to riding on a broom through the night was a man named Guillaume Edelin. He was arrested near Paris in 1453 and charged for witchcraft, despite being a priest. He was tortured, and he confessed to riding around on a broomstick with other witches, and was then locked up for the rest of his life in a stinky, violent prison. But witches on brooms wasn't any new kind of idea at the time. The idea dates back to at least the 12th century. That was when witches as we know them came into being. It started with a group of Christians called the Waldensians. 800 years ago, they were a group dedicated to God and just as devout as any other Christians, but they did one thing very different from the other sects. They allowed women to become priests and gave women full rights just like men. The Catholic Church hated this, branded the Waldensians as heretics, and the women priests as nothing but witches. As for the broomsticks, it actually has to do with ointments and creams that the witches allegedly brewed. People thought the witches would smear ointments on their broomsticks, which, when sat upon, would give them the powers of flight. The Necronomicon. The Necronomicon is an invention of fiction, something created by horror writer H.P. Lovecraft in the 20th century. But that hasn't stopped people from believing this dark book is a real legendary tome. And it certainly hasn't stopped all kinds of hoaxes and alleged translations from springing up since the 1970s. In 1973, Owlswick Press released an issue of a book called the Necronomicon that was written in an indecipherable language they called Duriac. The language turned out to be indecipherable because it was completely fictional. Then, in the late 1970s, another book came out claiming to be the very real translation of the Lost Necronomicon. But it didn't have anything to do with Lovecraft, and is instead based on a collection of stories from Sumerian mythology 4,000 years ago. Believe it or not, this has become the most popular Necronomicon ever, with 800,000 copies sold to interested readers by 2006. It might also be worth noting that the Vatican receives multiple letters every year by people who believe they have the book. These people think the Vatican is hiding a real copy of the magical Necronomicon in their secret archives. Johann de Witt. Johann de Witt was not a very good politician, at least not in the end. The Dutch man's father was a respected mayor, and Johann de Witt grew up in a time when the Netherlands was greatly prospering. He climbed through the social ranks until, in 1653, he was named Councillor Pensionary at 28 years old. In other words, he was the political leader of the Netherlands. But this would prove to be one of the darkest chapters for any Dutch ruler. He negotiated peace with England and France, was re-elected to his position 3 times in a row, and everything seemed like it was going fine, until 1665, when tension rose again and caused the Dutch and the English to go to war. Things were okay until 1672, when France decided to join in on the war as well, and suddenly the English and the French were attacking the Dutch Republic. Things didn't go well for the Dutch, and Johann de Witt was forced to resign in August 1672. But the Dutch weren't done with him. They surprised him with a lynch mob and literally ripped him to pieces. The mob was in such a frenzy that they tore their recently resigned ruler apart and ate him right there in the street. This is such a horrible piece of Dutch history that they actually built 3 statues of him in the 20th century, and all because they felt so bad about what happened over 300 years ago. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time. Bye!